I'm going to spotlight Harriet. So Harriet will be doing a presentation, followed by a discussion with Randall and others who can contribute to the conversation. So Harriet, the floor is yours. And I just need to say, Harriet was our keynote speaker a couple of years ago, and we so enjoyed having her. Very happy to have her back again, participating this year. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Julia, and thank you everybody for coming along. It's very nice for you to give up the time to come and be part of this, and it's a very great pleasure of mine to be here and to be with you. So I'm going to share my screen because I've got just a few slides that I'm going to talk about. So so first of all, I'm Harriet Patterson. I'm an erstwhile home educator. We have 3 children. They were all home educated until they were around 16 years of age, and they've all pinged off to do other exciting things now. And I am now a senior lecturer at Liverpool Hope University, lecturing in early childhood with a continuing interest, particularly in alternative education and particularly in home education. So the title that Juliet's given me tonight is Whose Children Are They? I think I added the anyway myself, and it was a bit of a sort of a militant anyway on the end of the question. And I want to address the question by looking at intersections of state, parents and children. So the first thing that I want to talk about is actually, I've got these 3 areas: state, parent and child. And I think the question of whose child are they lies at the intersection of those 3 things. And I think it's really pertinent that I've split parent and child rather than saying the state and the family, because I think that this is one of the big discursive moves that is taking place at the moment when we're talking about whose child is it, that we no longer talk about state and families. Parent and child have been separated into 2 different entities, a metaphorical breakdown of the family. And once you've done that, once you've separated out the family as a unit into parent and child, it becomes much easier to discursively suggest that these are 2 sets of people whose interests do not necessarily coincide and who in fact may be in conflict with each other. And I think that kind of discursive suggestion has really entered and is really altering the debate now about whose children are they. So our political system is based on liberal democracy, and one of the central ideas, or the central idea of liberal democracy, is that the individual should be free. It's been a tenet of Western moral philosophy for centuries, that individuals should be free, they should have autonomy over their own lives, over their own thinking, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. And in that sense, the state does not become involved in individual lives. The job of the state is to manage public affairs and to act on behalf of the citizens in the public arena. It is not to manage private lives or to tell people how they ought to live, as long as what they're doing is within the confines of the law. What often happens is when you look at a clear-cut situation like that, and it seems to be a clear-cut situation of where the state's remit lie, it all looks fine from a distance, but as you get closer and closer, things tend to get a little bit fuzzy, and they get particularly fuzzy around children, because initially it would seem very clear-cut that children are part of family life, they belong in family life, and they are not to do with the state. But the state does have an inherent interest in children, because those children are going to grow up, and when they grow up, they are going to be citizens of that state, and they are going to decide the future of that state. And I think when Randall was talking about these things last night, that state interest in children really came over strongly there. So having said that, we have in the UK had a history of fairly hands-off governments. There has been creep from the public arena into family life, but it's been a minor creep until we got to the 1990s. In 1997, Tony Blair's new Labour government voted into power, and social policy commentators looking back on that period of time tend to be in complete agreement that that government marked a really distinctive change between the public and the state. So this, I've picked out a few key points to sort of to talk to, reference the new Labour government. And the first of those, the initial one of those, was this 1998 consultation document that was called Supporting Families. And when it was published, Jack Straw, who was Home Secretary at the time, really enthusiastic about it, saying this is long overdue. It is long overdue that the state becomes involved in families. And part of the remit behind it, part of the arguments put forward in that document was that family life had changed. Big changes had taken place economically and socially in family life. So for one thing, women going out to work, it was becoming more and more common, and the government was supporting and wanted to support working women. So there was a childcare issue. Over and beyond that, the argument was that there were different kinds of families. Divorce was becoming more common. There were more step families and blended families. Single parenthood was becoming more accepted. So family life had changed. So there was that on the one side. And then on the other side was the idea that developmental psychology had grown. We knew professionals, knew academics, knew researchers, knew a lot more about childhood than they had known in the past. And we needed some kind of conduit for that knowledge to be passed down from universities, from developmental psychologists' labs where they were working away on things to do with childhood. There needed to be a kind of conduit that brought those things down into families so that this knowledge could be applied. And these were two big arguments behind the state becoming more involved in family life. So the flagship policy that put all this into motion for the new Labour government was Sure Start. And Sure Start brought together a range of children's services. The idea was that these services were going to be, they were going to be targeted initially, and then they were going to be open up, they were going to be universal services for all families to use. But there was also a strong element in Sure Start that targeted parents and was to do with changing parental lifestyles, getting parents into employment, holding classes for things like healthy shopping and cooking, you know, to change family diets. So there was a strong element of being involved with parents and shaping parents at the same time. The next big move that happened was the Victoria Climbié case in 2000. So Victoria Climbié was neglected and horrifically abused, tortured by the people who were supposed to be looking after her, and died an absolutely horrific death. Lord Laming conducted the public inquiry into her death, which fed forward into the Every Child Matters policy, and from there into the 2004 Children's Act. And one of the key points that Laming highlighted in his report was that Victoria had been known to professional services, but she had been known to medical services, she had been known to social services, but because those agencies had never shared information, nobody had built up an holistic picture of what was happening to her. And Laming's argument was, if there had been better data sharing, then this wouldn't have happened. It would have become obvious to professionals that they needed to intervene. And so the solution to all this was for professionals to begin sharing data. And again, as with Sure Start, it wasn't felt that this was something that should be targeted at families identified at being at risk or children identified at being at risk. This was proposed as a universal project. And New Labour's flagship database was called Contact Point, and Contact Point was going to share information across agencies for every child in the UK. So medical services, social services, educational services, they would be able to track any child at all, to find out what was happening with them and to share that information with other agencies. And of course, it raised huge civil liberties questions. Civil liberties groups and others were very concerned that the government should hold this level of information, and that parties should be able to access this information without a prior cause for doing so, without any particular reason for doing so. This information was going to be available. Contact point, one of the things about that, and again, it's something that Randall brought up last night, was that it's very difficult to sustain these civil liberties arguments when the counter argument is, yes, but this is to do with child protection. This is to do with protecting children. And if it saves one life, one child's life, one Victoria Climbié, it's worth it. And I think it is very hard to mount, and Brian Rose saying last night, we look as if we're standing up for child abusers when people say, hang on a minute, that doesn't feel quite right. In fact, Contact Point never came to fruition. It was millions was spent on it, and it was abandoned. I think it was abandoned in about 2009 because it wasn't going to work on a technological level, and it was, the whole enterprise was just too big. It was too expensive. I think it's important to recognise that that might have been what we might consider, what I would consider to be the right decision, but made for the wrong reasons, because the civil liberties argument never won out. The issues with sharing data at that level with that many people about every child in the country, those arguments never won out. So although Contact Point didn't happen, the thinking behind Contact Point didn't go away. At the same time, on the back of this, and in the 2000, on the back of the Victoria Climbié case, and in the 2004 Children's Act, risk started to become a much wider category as applied to children. There were brought in the 2004 Children's Act new categories of abuse that are without definition. So, for example, there is no legal definition of emotional abuse. It's a subjective term that social workers on the ground have to come up with a definition for. They have to put into practice, and the result is that lots of things that used to happen to children and just be considered part of family life now fall under a category of abuse. So, for example, parents having an argument, or a child being overweight, these are things that now fall under categories of abuse. So the state is expanding. It is expanding on both of these fronts. Can't go through this time period without mentioning the Bad Man Review. Don't need to tell anybody here what the Bad Man Review was about, but I think, and again, it goes back to some of the things that Randall was talking and that we were talking about last night. I mean, the Bad Man Review was absolutely hopeless in terms of its methodological expertise. It was made up statistics. It was carefully clipped quotes. It had a literature review that only cited, I think, 16 sources. It was riddled with problems as a piece of research. One of my favourite quotes about the Bad Man Review came from Professor James Conway at the University of Glasgow. And he said, I might be paraphrasing slightly, but he said that never in his 30 years of involvement in education had he seen anything that was so panic-riven and nakedly and naively populist. But the point is, it didn't matter. It didn't matter. Ed Balls and Labour government were prepared to accept the Bad Man Review in its entirety because it was saying what they wanted to hear. And again, we talked about this last night. I'm sure we'll talk about it again more tonight, that evidence is not what these debates seem to spin on. They spin on other ideas, other feelings, other emotions, and putting forward evidence is not necessarily the thing that steers and directs these debates. So as we all know, the Bad Man Review didn't happen. His recommendations, although they were accepted by the government, they were never put into practice, and that was because of the general election of 2010. And again, it was like Contact Point. You know, the right thing happened, but for the wrong reasons. The arguments that had underpinned Bad Man and the feelings about the dangers of home education that had underpinned Bad Man have not gone away. So we had the change of government and a coalition government, Conservative-led coalition government came into power, and we might have expected at that time that there would be a change in policy direction, you know, with a different party, and the Conservatives having always been considered to be the more hands-off, the more liberal, rather than social party. But it didn't work out like that. 2011, riots swept across the country, and on the back of those and trying to sort those out, the Conservatives set up the Troubled Families programme. And one of the key tenets of that David Cameron was personally really keen on was, we've had rioters on the streets. The reason that those young people have gone out there and set fire to things and looted and vandalized and knocked over the bins and, you know, and generally behaved in a deplorable manner, the reason for that is that they haven't been brought up properly. And if we can get into families and make sure that families bring up children properly, we will sort out these social problems. Again, his idea was, we're not just going to target a few individual families who we think might be at risk in this concern. We want to make everybody go to parenting classes. We want to make sure that all parents have the benefit of the government's wisdom in bringing up their children. So we have huge involvement, and at the moment this doesn't, you know, apart from the Bad Man Review, this doesn't look as if it has anything particular to do with home education, but I think it is laying down for us an important historical platform on which we are basing our arguments and our struggles with the acceptability of home education today. Before we, before we leave my review of the state, I just want to have a look at the cover of the Allen report that people may have seen before. This was Graham Allen MP's report following the Troubled Families programme that fed into the Troubled Programmes family, championing early intervention into families. And this infamous cover of the report shows the cross-section of two children's brains, and the top brain comes from what Alan calls a normal child, and he points out that a 3-year-old child, and he points out that if children are brought up properly, the state will not have to pay lots of money to sort them out. If, on the other hand, children are not brought up properly, if the right early interventions are not made, then that child is going to end up costing the state a lot of money, as the rioters of 2011 ended up costing the state a lot of money, partly through benefits and partly through the kind of interventions that need to be made later on to try and get their lives back on track, get the families' lives back on track, to keep them out of prison, or to have them on rehabilitation programs, or whatever it takes. It's going to cost a lot of money. So the cost-benefit analysis going on there, and very much at the forefront of policy thinking. The cover is a little bit disingenuous. We are used to bad evidence in all of these debates. The cross-section of the 3-year-old brain at the bottom is not a neglected child from the UK. It's actually a child from a Romanian orphanage who was basically dumped in a cot at a couple of months old and had very little human interaction over the first few years of life to lead to that cross-section. But these arguments have gained a lot of political traction. They've gained a lot of political traction, and neuroscience now is being used to underpin all sorts of policies that justify early intervention into families. So that is my first take on where the state stands in terms of whose children are they. The state has made a huge stake in the lives of children. I'm going to turn now and talk about parenting. Talk about the ideas about children belonging to parents, and crucial to those arguments at the moment are changes that have taken place in how society, as well as politicians, understand what it means to be a parent. And I'm talking about the same kind of time period that I've talked about from, you know, the 1990s to the present day. And the way that parenting is viewed has really shifted during that time. For one thing, this idea of parenting, that you are not a parent, it's not a noun, it's not something that you are, it's a verb, it's something that you do. And I always think, you know, Frank Furedi, commentator on parenting, and wrote the book Paranoid Parenting, dates the rise of this word parenting from about the same period as the 1990s, as the new Labour government coming to power. There are two things that have happened in tandem with each other. Now, when I was growing up, if you wanted to know if my mother or my father was a good mother or a good father, you'd ask me, because I'm the child. And I'm the only person eventually who can judge that relationship. I seem to have got, I'm just going to pull this curtain. There, it looks like a ghost is talking to you. Hopefully that's better. That idea of being a parent, being located in that relationship, that personal relationship between a mother and a father and a child, has shifted on to an idea about parenting being a series of tasks that a parent undertakes. And if you want to know if somebody is a good parent or not, you don't look at that personal relationship. You look at what might be called their skill set around parenting. Parenting has become more and more technologized. It's, you know, if your child does A, then you react by doing B, and the outcome will be C. And that's the kind of thinking that lies behind parenting classes. It lies behind all of these different publications and media presentations. There's Super Nanny there, very, very precise technical instructions about how to be a good parent. So I've watched Super Nanny in action. Very precise instructions. You know, when you are talking to your child, this is the pose that you adopt, this is the way that you stand, this is the words that you say, this is the amount of time that your child has to sit on the naughty step or undergo their, you know, their punishment. These are the words that the child must say back to you. This is how long you must hold your child's gaze for. Very, very precise technological instructions about how to be a good parent. And this has become seen, and it's back to Alan's picture of those cross sections of brain. This has come to be seen as being completely deterministic, not just in what your child is today or how you manage your child's behavior in the day, but what's going to happen to your child in the future. And not least, how much is your child going to cost the state in the future? And there's a huge mistrust of parents has grown up alongside that. It's become so important. It's become so important in the public imagination that parenting is carried out in this technical and precise way that there's now huge mistrust about parents. And again, Randall brought it up the other last night about this idea of invisible children. Your child is invisible if they're not seen by a professional on a daily basis, if they're not seen by a teacher on a daily basis. And one of the saddest things that I have experienced around this is back in 2019, when we could still do these things, I went to an international conference on the European Early Childhood Education and Care Conference, international conference, delegates from all over Europe. One of the keynote speakers showed us a film, and it was a film of a Syrian father. And this man's story was that he had escaped from Syria with his wife and his young son. His wife had been drowned in the Mediterranean when their boat overturned, but he had managed to get his little boy to the Netherlands, and they were starting a new life there. They were living in a refugee hostel, and the boy was being taken away for, you know, every day to educational activities and sporting activities and children's activities and so on. And the father was being sent to parenting classes. And this guy sat and looked into the camera and said, before I came here, I didn't understand how to be a father. I didn't understand that you had to treat your children in a particular way. I didn't understand that, you know, that I needed to manage their behavior, that being a parent is a science. I've been doing it wrong all these years. My parents have been doing it wrong. We have no culture of how to be parents in the country that I come from. But these lovely people, these nice people in the Netherlands, teaching me how to do it. And everybody sat there with all these delegates, and everybody was clapping and saying, isn't this marvelous? And we need more programs like this. And isn't this fantastic? And I just remember looking around that conference hall and just thinking, you know, it's feeling like an alien from, you know, is it me as the alien, or is it all these other people? You know, this man has rescued his son. He has taken him out of a war zone. You know, all the resourcefulness and the bravery and the resilience and the love that has gone into saving his son. You know, and he arrives in the Netherlands and they tell him that you don't know how to be a father. And I'm sorry, I get really emotional when I think about it, because I think it's really chilling that that's the level that we've reached. So we have huge mistrust of the family, huge mistrust of parents' ability to bring up their own children. And as we've done that, we have moved from a social view in which the family was kind of the haven, where people went to recoup and to recharge, and to be themselves and to be supported so that they could go out and face school, work, the big wide world out there, to the family becoming a place that is seen increasingly as a site of risk and abuse, from which children in particular need to have protection. So I'm going to turn now and think about children and the place of children in this, and back to Juliet's question of whose children are they? So I'm going to get to the ladder in a minute. Because one way that we can answer that question, and I think we're increasingly starting to answer that question, is to say, well, actually, children don't belong to anybody. They don't belong to the state and they don't belong to their parents. They are individual people in their own right, and they have agency over their own lives in their own right. And that is a point of view that I think is being put forward more and more in these debates. And in some ways, it is merely an extension of those kind of liberal ideas that we started off with, the idea that personal autonomy, freedom of the individual is incredibly important. And all we are doing in putting that argument forward is saying children are part of this too. And we need to extend that as a society to children, those levels of autonomy. But I think that there is a rather more, a darker side to that. In some of the arguments that are being put forward, because behind them lie quite individualistic arguments about what a good life is, and the kind of life that we ought to be proposing for our children. And that is one in which autonomy is seen as being an ongoing project of the self, that having a good life is about the concerted cultivation of the self. And very often this is put to us in terms of children fulfilling their potential. What's important for children is that they fulfill their potential, and anything that might stand in the way of them fulfilling that potential needs to be got rid of. So it doesn't matter if that's their culture, or their traditions, or their family way of life, or their religion. If it is getting in the way of this concerted cultivation of self, then it needs to be disposed of. It needs to be moved aside. And that, in that, I would include attitudes towards families as well. And the main vehicle, I think, in which that point of view is put forward is children's rights, particularly UNCRC, and that has become an important document in the debate about home education, and around home education. And I think part of what that has done is back to what I was talking about at the beginning, and the breakup, the metaphorical, discursive breakup of the family into parents and children rather than families. Children's rights, I think, has been part of that breakup. It's been part of saying children's interests may not be in tandem with parents' interests. These are two sets of people who may structurally be in conflict with each other. And part of that structural conflict may be that parents and families impede this cultivation of the self, this idea of children fulfilling their potential. So UNCRC, 54 articles laying out globally how the world's children should be protected, how they should be provided for, and how they should participate in society. UNCRC was drawn up in, when it was published, the draft was published in 1989. It was ratified by the UK in 1991, so a few years before the new Labour government came to power. It took about 10 years to draft, and I think that looking at UNCRC as an historical document, it is very much a child of the 80s, a product of 1980s thinking. I think if it were being drawn up now, today, I think it might be a document with rather different premises. It was always the intention that this was going to be an international treaty. In fact, it is the most signed up international treaty that there has ever been. The only country in the world not to have ratified UNCRC is the United States. So it has absolute global reach, and it applies to all the world's children in all their diversity. And when you start thinking about the scale of that diversity, it's huge. I mean, you know, the age band alone, from newborn babies to 18-year-olds who would count as adults in most societies by the age of 18. So it's that complete spread of age. It's both genders, it's all cultures, it's all religions, it's regardless of material resources, it's regardless of socio-economic context, it's regardless of political affiliation. It applies to everybody, every child. And so built into UNCRC inevitably is a high degree of ambiguity, and it necessitates a high degree of interpretation. And Hart's ladder of participation is actually about that degree of interpretation. So the argument is that participation can be seen in sort of 8 different layers that are laid out here, all the way from right at the bottom when Hart's talking about forms of participation, which are rhetorical forms of participation, not forms that he actually counts as true participation. And there are ideas like manipulation, decoration, tokenism, in which children maybe appear to be participating in things. And I always think, you know, from the home education point of view, I always think, you know, an example is to say that a child going to school is participating in education. Well, yes, they are in a sense because they're going to school, but we all know that participating in education is not necessarily fulfilled by going to school. Right the way through to rung 8 on his ladder, where he's saying children are directing and making decisions, and adults are the resources to back up those decisions. And that maybe pushes us towards that idea of children's purpose, or the purpose which is visited on children by society, being this intense cultivation of the self and this idea of fulfilling potential without recourse to any to any kind of context in which that should happen. So UNCRC needs to be interpreted, and that interpretation takes place, I think, at 2 separate levels. It takes place at the collective level, in which a society decides what UNCRC means in its application to that particular society. So if we take Article 3 of UNCRC, which is the one on the best interests of the child, and is one which is absolutely open to interpretation. How do we interpret what the best interests of the child is in any given situation? And on the collective level, I suggest that we interpret that by recourse to the normative. I can't see at the moment any other lens through which that collective interpretation might be made. So if you are in a society where it is normal for children to go to school, then it seems to me that the logic will take you down the path that the best interest of the child is to go to school, because otherwise the argument would be that the best interests of the child in that society as a collection are not being upheld. Obviously, there are other levels at which we can think about the interpretation of UNCRC. So the personal level of the child, what the child may consider to be in their best interests, what the parent may consider to be in the child's best interests, what a professional involved in any particular situation might consider to be in the child's best interests. And if it were to go to, if this was a situation that might end up in a courtroom, how a judge might perceive the best interests of the child. And of course, all of those recourse to the values of the people who are making that interpretation. And that is true as well of any judge presiding over that kind of family court decision. I had a really interesting conversation with a retired High Court Judge, Sir Mark Headley, talking about the role of values in judicial decisions. You know, and he made the point very firmly that you can't, if you're a judge, you can't hang up your values at the door with your coat when you come into the office in the morning. They are what you use to make your decisions. So we have a highly interpretive document that we can recourse to, and I think we are in a position where UNCRC, an article of UNCRC, could be cherry-picked to uphold pretty much any argument, be used to underpin pretty much any argument around what is right for children. And I think we are seeing plenty of that going on. I think even in things like the UNICEF submission to the Education Committee, we can see that there has been a cherry-picking of articles that uphold a particular point of view. And that begs another question about interpretation. Are we meant to interpret UNCRC as a document as a whole, or are we meant to go through it and looking for the bits that seem to be applicable in any given situation? And arguments like the best interests of the child are being put forward on that kind of individual basis. But if you look at UNCRC as a whole, quite a different picture emerges. So I have here a not very scientific table, which I drew up. It's not scientific because I put some of the articles in multiple columns. But overall, when you read the whole of UNCRC, it firmly locates the child within the family. Over half the articles talk about the location of the child within the family. And as I say, I viewed as an historical document, I wonder if it would be written in these terms today, but it has been written in those terms. And it seems to me that when these kind of cherry picking exercises go on, you lose that whole overview of the child being located in the family. And indeed, final slide here, some of the articles which are cited, like Article 3, selectively cited, we don't hear very much about the second paragraph, which makes explicit mention of parents and the role of parents in deciding the best interests of the child. We don't often see it as we would if we were looking at the whole of UNCRC as a whole. We don't often see it in juxtaposition to Article 5, which underlines the respect that needs to be extended to parents in making decisions about children. So I've totally lost track of time. I'm not sure where I stand on my half hour.
I think your half hour is over, actually, but
over, right. I'll make it a really quick summing up then. I think I haven't talked very much about home education. I have talked about the ground which I think is underlying the debate, and I do think that it's important that in taking the debate further, that we understand that this is the grounds on which we are arguing, and these are some of the this is some of the thinking which is shaping that debate as it goes forward. Anyway, I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harriet. I mean, there's certainly plenty in there, which is why I'm loath to restrict, really. I think people want to hear everything. So I'm going to add, Randall, I'm going to be spotlighting you there. I don't think Wendy has joined us. I don't believe she's joined us. So it may be a conversation between the two of you then.
Oh, gosh.
Randall, perhaps you want to give some thoughts, though.
I'll start off then. Yeah, Wendy's not on the participants list.
Yeah.
I think that's important, Harriet, because we so often look at the issues around home education in isolation to everything else that's going on in society. We look at them in that sense of saying, this is all about home education. Why are they persecuting us? That actually, this is an anti-parent mindset.
Yeah.
I heard, and it is only hearsay, I cannot quote this as fact. I can only say I heard it as hearsay from somebody who's at a DFE meeting not that long ago, and a member from a religious minority in a conversation about children said, you have to remember that children belong to families. And a member of the DFE staff burst out and said, no, they don't. They are independent, rights-bearing citizens, and it is our job to protect them.
Yes.
And I think that sums up the mindset. And I think, as you were saying, Harriet, that is where a lot of people are coming from, and ordinary people do not understand that is where the conversation is. I've started using a phrase in the last 15 months, so you can understand where maybe it's come from, but a lot of these issues are unreported and therefore unexplained to the average person in the street.
Yeah.
And we just get swept along with that agenda. So that would be my instant reaction. Julia, have you opened the chat?
Yes, let's do that.
Right.
Okay. Well, one of my volunteers is very honored. Thank you. So the chat has been enabled, and we will welcome questions. We've got something from Boa.
Right. Well, Boa says the slogan of the Department of Basic Education in South Africa is every child is a national asset. I think that sums up what you've been saying, Harriet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, very, very much the state making its stake in childhood.
Yeah.
Another question there.
Yeah, go on. You bring that one in, Julia.
How much is the anti-parent mindset coming from people who have had abuse themselves in some way? Take, for example, being sent away to boarding school for education. Does it come from their own experience of hatred of their own parents? So I think if perhaps somebody who's, when people have perhaps had no choice or autonomy in their own lives as young people, there's some residue of resentment coming into that. That's, I think, the question. Do you think?
Any comments, Harriet? So do you want me to wait?
Well, I don't know. My reaction to that would be, well, yes, potentially that might be something in an individual's background that makes them feel that, perhaps parents can't be trusted. But I don't think that really explains the full force of the political and the public. There's things like Super Nanny, it's very media driven, all the publications, if you go onto Amazon or someone like that and you put in, parenting books, hundreds will come up. There are people out there making loads of money telling other people how to bring up their children. I think it is it feels to me like more than individuals reacting to a situation. It feels like it has much more power behind it than that. I don't know what Randall thinks.
I'm wondering, to be honest, Harriet, know, last night Brian raised the question of the horror stories told about home education to make it seem as a bad thing. Where does that come from? For me, that comes not from fact, but from this area where people are actually wanting to discredit because they've got another agenda that they cannot market to people. If they came out with this idea that parents are a danger to children, and they started marketing that one, then there would be problem. And I feel, yeah, some people, as you say, may have that background. There was an interesting article in the TES about 3 weeks ago, and the headline was, "Is there a psychopath in your school?"
Yeah.
And the whole point of the argument was that schools are set up as ideal places for psychopaths to work because it gives them power over vulnerable people. Now, there is a nature of people that wants to dominate others out of a lack of empathy, but for themselves. And we can't rule out that some of the people designing this mindset want power over other people's children. And they don't want to actually admit that. So that some of that may come from their upbringing, but I think it's more there is a worldview about, which is what I was trying to touch on last night, which is that the future of society depends on children who are not hurt, damaged by their parents. Going back to Man's point that by the time somebody gets to be an adult, they are fixed in their character. But if you can get at them while they're young, and children are like wax, you can mold them to what you want them to be. And I think there's a bunch of ideologues influencing this debate, but they can't be honest because they know if they were honest, the public would say, we're not having that. So they have to sell it in this language of the best interest of the child without saying, how do you define the best interests of the child?
I mean, I think there's a policy angle to that as well, that, when you see somebody like David Cameron championing parenting classes as a way of solving antisocial behavior amongst teenagers, that you're not politically, you're looking at the family. And I think this is happening more and more, is that social problems are seen, if children are obese, it's the family's fault, because they've not been feeding them right, or, rather than looking outside that to the problem as a structural issue about, why are people having to live the way that they are? Why are teenage young men so fed up that they want to go out and set fire to things and smash shop windows? Why haven't they got something better to do in their lives? That a simple political answer is to say, well, it's their parents' fault, rather than, actually we haven't got proper employment opportunities for these people, or, we haven't ensured that families have enough money to live on, so it's locating social problems with people who I think, I mean, like the title of that, and we hear it all the time, this dreadful word support. We are supporting families, we are supporting people. And no, you're not. You're manipulating them. You're telling them what to do. You're taking away their choices.
Yeah. Do you want to have a look at the chat there, Randall? Comment on anything?
I was just going to come back to Harriet on that one first, Julia, because I think it's ironic. With people like Cameron saying parents do not know how to parent. In days gone by, where did children learn how to parent? In the home. They had siblings, they had nieces and or cousins around, and parenting was done at home. But now we've moved education and made it academic. We stopped helping children learn life skills. And so, as Harriet says, it becomes far easier to say, oh, these children weren't failed in school to become parents. We just delay the parenting classes till it's too late, really. And so that is the type of thing I think we've got to see. And it's a patch up. It's a patch up for a job badly done, where if children learned to parent in their families and watched other members of the family with parenting skills, it still wouldn't be perfect. But the massive rise we've seen over recent decades in families who struggle must be a sign that the school system isn't preparing children for life. So that's coming back to it. Bowie says, how can a mechanistic approach to parenting be reconciled with the fact that every child is unique? And I'll let you start on that one, because not every child is unique. Every child is universal, aren't they, Harriet?
Well, it's a funny thing, actually, because, you know, we do get told that every child is unique, and we get told that quite a lot, even while they're, you know, shoved into standardized provision and standardized ways of being dealt with. And it does seem to be a sort of that idea of a little bit of lip service. I mean, myself, I don't think that a mechanistic approach to any personal relationship is the right way to go about it. And I think if you've just reduced, you know, if you think about a personal relationship, about the emotion, the intimacy, the co-construction of meaning, you know, the way that you relate to your child or to your parents or to your friends or your husband or your wife or whoever, you know, the mechanistic approach just doesn't encompass what that kind of relationship is about. And yet we seem to have just gone merrily down this path of thinking, you know, we're bringing up children as a technology. And I think, I mean, myself, I think, you know, that part of this discursive separation of parents and children is being mirrored by the physical separation of parents and children. I think it's something like 80% of 1-year-olds are now in some form of daycare. You know, parents and children, they don't spend time together. They don't, you know, they don't maybe have those opportunities. I think that we as home educators, you know, it is just, it becomes your way of life. But I think it's very hard for us to get our heads around how exceptional it is that you spend your time with your children.
Yeah. I think the pandemic revealed that, where so many parents suddenly rediscovered their children and were surprised, really.
One of the best bits of report research, that it was self-selecting and not very academic, shall we say, but Kinder Surprise, the little chocolate egg people with a toy inside, did some research that was published about 2 or 3 months ago, and it reported that over half of children now consider their parents to be their best friends.
Yeah.
And I thought, brilliant.
Yeah.
You know, that was good, because really that is what parenting's about. In many ways, it's about being friends with your children.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that kind of sort of super nanny parenting manual, you know, when you've got people who are stressed and time poor and trying to get kids out the door and trying to get to work and trying to juggle all these different things, it must look like, oh, if I just do A, then B will happen and my life will be easy again. Must look really seriously tempting. But it's not really understanding either the unique child or the unique relationship that you have with your child. With your child.
There was an earlier question here from Monica. Says, that was a fantastic presentation, Harriet, thank you, but very chilling. How do we spread this analysis without sounding like crazy folk? And this is true, because, you know, we are passionate about this, aren't we?
I'll get that ball rolling in the sense that over the last 2 or 3 months, Harriet, me and Joe Merritt have been talking around this agenda. And I know Harriet's trying to get together a proper academic paper on it, but we also need something out at popular level. And in a way, our conversation tonight, my presentation last night, is all about getting that conversation started. Because one of the best things that can happen for people is almost so that they get equipped, so that if something comes up in a conversation, you can just say to somebody, have you thought about why that's happening? Have you thought about the message behind that? Because a lot of people don't actually connect with the language that's being used. You know, you talk about the rights of the child, and it's a very positive message. You equip that with, you parallel that with pictures of children suffering, say in a war zone. It's a very powerful message. But how is that being interpreted, and what's the message behind it? One of the videos I didn't share last night, but I have put the link on my session thing, was released in March by UNESCO and the EU, and its subtitle is 5 Ways to Help Your Children with Their Homework. But there's only 4, but all of them are negative about parents not just neglecting their duties, but treating their children badly. And it really is one of the most sickening videos I have seen for a long time. It's only about 3.5 minutes long. And it's to encourage governments, whatever happens in future pandemics, not to shut schools, to keep schools open, because homes are not safe. And that is the message behind it. So when you hear something there and you're talking to somebody and they say, what do you think about that? Say, if we're more informed, we can then begin to talk about it with people. But there are other groups who are concerned about the undermining of parental responsibility in society. And maybe we need to see if any of those we can join in that message on some way without having to swallow or take on board the whole of their agenda. But I think there is a need for a bigger awareness amongst adults of what is being said, that parents are not reliable, and therefore the state has got to become the de facto parent of every child. And I ran it in my presentation at last one. There's a video about by an American woman, I'll remember her name at some point, where in about 1 minute she says, we've got too much a concept of parenting being private. We need to start talking about our children. And she's talking about it partly in economics, but she's saying children belong to everybody. Harriet, I've probably talked too much. Anything you want to say?
No, I think you're right. I think the more that we get these ideas on the move and backing up our discussions, and the more that we try and hold other people to account about what they are saying, which is very difficult, because the people that you really want to lobby and to ask questions to will just not talk to us, you know. But if you get the chance to talk to your MP, or you get the chance to talk to anybody really about these things, to get over the points of view that we're talking about, you know, it's not just home educators, it's parents in general, and it's overreach by the state in general in all sorts of ways.
Yeah. I like, so Neka has put a comment here. She said, the titling of this session and much of what has been discussed seems to be one of power. But isn't it that the state wants power over, whereas home educators are about power with, much more collaborative? Is that a fair statement?
You're on me, Harriet, first.
Well, I'll go and then I'll see what Randall says. I think, I mean, as a home educator myself, I don't think power was on my agenda at all. You know, I wanted to be with my children and have a nice way, a nice family way of life, you know, to be able to spend my time with them and appreciate them growing up. And I don't see, you know, we've been forced into this position. I don't see home educators as being, you know, militant or aggressive or wanting power or wanting to tell other people how to do things. I think we've been forced into this position.
I'm very much with Brian Ray in what he said yesterday afternoon in his session, and I'll say to everybody, if you've not watched that, do watch it. Brian doesn't normally use the word rights, and I don't, and I would also not use the word power. I tend to use the word responsibilities, and I think this is about whose responsibility is it? Now, okay, we all have different ideas of how to work out our responsibilities to other people. We don't all do that the same way. We're all learning. You know, let's face it, lifelong education is still going on for me at my age, and all of you who are much younger than me. And we're all learning how to work out our responsibilities to the people. But when it comes to children, we all start with little or no experience. Somebody said there's many parents today who've never held a baby until they hold their own. You know, I have no research facts on that, but I can imagine it being the case. But actually, you've never had a baby as your responsibility till you've got one of your own, from the majority of people. And it is a responsibility. You don't pick that baby up and hold them in your arm and think, I've got a right over you, or I've got power over you. You look at them and think, I've got a responsibility for you. You're dependent on me. And I've said for a long time, the job of a parent is to nurture a child so they move from total dependence to independence. And that is where I would go. I would talk about, no, this is about being responsible. We are the natural parents of that child. We have number one responsibility for that child, to them and maybe to others. And it is encouraging people. Now, yes, we all know, sadly, not all parents fulfill that responsibility. And there needs to be some form of safety net. But I think from the nuclear family to the state is too big a gap in that safety net. I would say that over history, the natural way has been parents, then the extended family, then the local community. And in time, if all those fail the child, perhaps somebody bigger can come in. But at the moment now, all we've got a lack of responsibility from those other circles. You know, I remember, I go back, my political involvement in home education goes back to the days of Kaya Rishak. And after she was taken out of school, a neighbour noticed that the children from that family were eating dry bread off the bird table in the garden. Not once, not twice, but continually. And she could see they were getting thinner, or they could see they were getting thinner, and she reported them to social services. Now, that was a welfare concern. But how many people would have done that? We live in a society now where you actually look away when you see somebody doing something wrong because you don't want to get involved. And we've got that breakdown of the natural community. And so now it's left to the state to pick it up. But the state thinks it's infallible, thinks it can't get anything wrong. And so it denies getting things wrong. The recent publicity over sexual abuse in schools. is hopefully will lay bare something of the fact that the state says children need to be in school to be safe. And if they carry on saying that without saying we've got serious problems, then they're not being honest. So in that area, I would say, I want to talk about responsibilities, not power, not rights, but responsibilities.
Mm. Thank you, Randall. I think that those cases, as you say, that were in the news recently, I think, I think that's the frustration for us, is because it gets ignored. So, we, even in, there's still no change. We have a lot of people choosing to home educate because there are issues for their child in school, where the child's needs are not being met, or the child is in danger. Sometimes it's abuse by peers, sometimes it's abuse by staff. There's a whole host of problems, and yet that does not get addressed. Instead, the solution from the sort of education department, from their side, is to just try and plug the dike to prevent people from leaving, and force people to continue in a system that's abusive to them. So that, I think, that is where we have a real problem, is you don't have that accountability from those systems that are in place. Okay, do you think that's a natural place there to end our session tonight?
Yeah, unless you want me to just respond quickly to Esther and Ed in the chat.
Yes, go for it.
Right, Esther and Ed say, yes, could selling parenting mechanisms work because parents are not confident in their role? The idea out there is that by a certain age, you lose your child, they grow up, so you have a limited time to do it right. That idea that you lose your child by a certain age is very strong, but I want to respond by telling you one thing I picked up during the first 3 months of last year, when the pandemic was new to us all. Some authoress put on her Twitter feed that her grandchildren seemed to really be enjoying being at home and much happier. Please discuss. And she got this stream of people saying, yeah, my children feel much happier as well. But the one that's relevant to this is one mother posted something along the lines, I feel like I've got my son back. My 16-year-old boy is talking to me now. He doesn't do that when he's at school. And so why do people lose their children? They're mixing in a culture where parents aren't cool, where it's not right to get on with your parents. I would suggest that wanting to do them. Tony Blair's idea, 50% of children in school means 50% of children moving away from their families. And that's creating another little hobby horse of mine. Our mobility and everything is what's behind a lot of the social care crisis, because children are not around to relate to their parents as they get older. They're scattered everywhere. I've got 6 children. Nearest live an hour away. One lives in Finland. That's a long way. But, that's what I would say is, yeah, people do lose their children, but is it necessary, or is it a product of the system?
Okay, so I think on that note, and I just want to, we'll bring to a close, but I want to thank you, Harriet, for your presentation. Certainly a lot to chew on. Tomorrow night, we will be talking about the parent as the child's champion. So taking this conversation once again a step further with Alison Sauer. And we just want to thank you for your time. Thank you for the thought that's gone into the presentation. We will also be hearing from Harriet again on Saturday to do with rethinking learning to read, which will be very good, I know. And we have some thank yous from our audience. So thank you very much. We'll give you a round of applause there. And good night, everybody. We've got another full day tomorrow.